Dr. Cummings. While Dr. Cummings is getting to the podium, let me thank the Honorable Minister for recognizing the very many people who made contributions towards this bill. I just wanted to add a few names: Dr. Leslie Ramsamy, Mahendro Jainarain, the children of Mr. the late George Subraj, Tony and Jasmine, along with the wife, and Richard Mahays, Sandy Adams, all from that foundation. Honorable Member Dr. Karen Cummings.
Mr. Speaker, as a medical practitioner and public health specialist, I rise to play my part and to join in the debate and to speak to the bill number 19 of 2021, which addresses the donation and removal of organs, tissues, cells, and biofluids for transplantation and blood transfusion, and for the use for regenerative medicine and other therapeutic purposes, medical education, and scientific research purposes. The sources of organs for transplantation, that is, living donor, related and non-related, cadaveric donor, and brain-dead patients. In other words, Mr. Speaker, 4 categories of donation by living persons should be distinguished. Living related organ donation, that's blood or emotional directed donation to a loved one, altruistic organ donation, non-directed donation in which the donor gives an organ to the general pool to be transplanted into the recipient at the top of the waiting list. Living non-related organ donation, that's directed donation to a stranger, whereby donors choose to give to a specific person with whom they have no prior emotional connection. And cross donation, where a living donor wants to donate to his blood or emotional relative an organ, but blood groups does not match. There's a complete mismatch or cross matching is positive. Fred Kate once wrote on human organ transplantation, The Road of Law, and stated that transplantation is sharply curtailed by a shortage of donated organs and tissues. He further stated that the number of people who either die of conditions for which transplantation is indicated or are maintained on suboptimal therapies in the absence of a transplant far exceeds the number of transplants performed. He noted that in 1990, 18,592 people needed a transplanted kidney, only half received one. 40,959 needed a heart, only 1 in 20 received one. 14,751 needed a liver, only 1 in 5 received one. 4,108 needed a pancreas, only 1 in 8 got one. So the increasing incidence of vital organ failure and the inadequate supply of organs, especially from cadavers, has created a gap, a wide gap between organ supply and organ demand, and has resulted in very long waiting times to receive an organ, as well as an increasing number of deaths while waiting. Mr. Speaker, it was Kantrovich who reported in his article, The Society, the Barriers to Organ Donation and Alternatives for Change, that shortage is a social, psychological, ethical, moral, and political problem, causing unjustifiable damage to public health. Mr. Speaker, organ transplantation is considered a medical miracle and an important milestone of the 20th century, yea, the 21st century. Yet, organ donations will continue to be an extremely sensitive issue for societies around the world, where the emphasis placed on the body of the deceased persons is of great significance. According to the Council of Europe, December 2020, on addressing human rights and biomedicine, a public debate of this nature should be adapted to a cultural context. Hence, a topical issue like human organ and tissue transplantation in a multi-ethnic and diverse country like Guyana could be a complex issue. And the preservation of the integrity of the body of a deceased person by various culture groups must not be minimized by the state. However, Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the Assembly are positive that organ transplantation is morally acceptable with the consent of the donor and without excessive risk for him or her, and that this noble act of organ donation must occur after death, where the real death of the donor must be fully ascertained. Mr. Speaker, during the APNU-AFC coalition government in 2017, there was a drafting of this legislation to outlaw commercial human organ harvesting, transplant tourism, and organ trafficking, which worldwide has been an incredibly attractive and lucrative business, but an illegal global market. With collaboration with the University of Calgary in Canada, meetings were held with local stakeholders to discuss and fine-tune the content of the draft legislation. The Canadian consultant, the Ministry of Public Health officials, and the representatives of the Attorney General's chambers made suggestions as to the way forward Guyana could secure the much-needed help to develop legislation to regulate brain and cardiorespiratory death law and organ transplantation law. Rules were set which defined the precise circumstances and mechanisms under which organs of a deceased person could be donated. In addition, efforts were made for donor guarantees and recipient safety, and for the prohibition of unethical practices such as transplant tourism, as I alluded to earlier, commercial organ harvesting sales, and organ trafficking for the profitable underground economy. The bill represents a good start. There is cause to set it to the park. If not seriously protected, this bill puts public health against private wealth. The bill has a measure of goodwill, yet holds still. Why, Mr. Speaker? Danger links with potential perks. Mr. Speaker, it's not a secret that illegal organ harvesting has led to the equally notorious trafficking in persons tip global business. The World Health Organization has said that patients in the United States of America, USA, can pay as much as $70,000 US to over $160,000 US for a transplant package. It has been stated that more than 120,000 patients in the US need various forms of organ transplants, which include kidneys, bone marrow, liver, lung, intestine, and cornea, and that 5 new persons per hour are added to the waiting list in the USA. Here in Guyana, kidney transplant surgery is done free of cost at the GPHC, more or less, but costs as much as 40,000 US, so Guyana 8 million can be achieved at a private hospital. Hence, we have seen under the APNU-AFC tenure, the establishing of Guyana's public kidney transplant program and the advancing of the nephrology and dialysis unit at the Georgetown Public Hospital Corporation, GPHC. The unit benefits patients diagnosed with end-stage kidney disease requiring permanent dialysis. Mr. Speaker, chronic disease places a great burden on the healthcare system as it takes up 70% of the healthcare budget, because of complications due to illnesses such as diabetes, with end-stage renal disease and cataract, liver disease, and among others. Therefore, transplantation would be superior to dialysis in terms of cost, longer life expectancy and longevity, better quality of life, and higher productivity. In Guyana, transplantation today is constrained not by medical issues, but by legal ones. And their resolution is essential to saving lives and reducing human suffering. It has been long established that the long-term management of transplant recipients is focused on reduction in morbidity and mortality and improving quality of life, while simultaneously balancing the side effects of immunosuppressive drugs with risk of graft failure. As you may be aware, Mr. Speaker, that the most radical provision in the bill would be the legalizing of the removal of an organ when the brain stops functioning, but the heart and the lungs are kept going through artificial means. Hence, careful attention must be paid by medical practitioners to not to abandon the concept of brain death, but retain the practices in organ transplantation. In other words, there must be the maintenance of commitment to the dead donor rule by not removing vital organs from individuals before they are declared dead. Hence, the irreversible loss of circulation should be a major defining characteristic of death. Mr. Speaker, permit me to address some highlights of the bill. Before us, Bill number 19 of 2020, where one can conclude that there are two sorts of cadavers donation. One, where the donor can specify the recipient in advance, and the other where the donated organ can go to any recipient who may need such a human organ, such as a kidney or a cornea. Further analysis of this bill, 19 of 2021, does indicate that there is no section that deals with or obligates law enforcement officers, firefighters, paramedics, or other emergency rescuers and hospital personnel to make searches for documents such as a gift or other information identifying the bearer or donor who has refused to make an anatomical gift. At Part 2, Section 6, the minister may give directives as minister considers necessary, and the agency shall give effect to the directives. The minister should specify, at least broadly, what the statement means. Would it be policy direction on education, on a mandated choice, on presumed consent, or on incentives? Mr. Speaker, permit me to remind you that there is individual autonomy of the organ donor, and the minister must know that any mandated policy would require an enormous level of trust by the person. Mr. Speaker, the minister tends to follow models from Spain and Canada. As you recall, is just decreased testing of teachers and students and by extension public servants for the COVID-19. So those who became ill had to be in home isolation, going out. You're not able to test, PCRs just for hospitalized patients and so forth. So I'm saying that the minister seems to be following the models like Canada and so forth. So in Canada, there's a practice of presumed consent, where organs are taken after the person would have died, a moderate proposal. We do not know if the minister would be directing the agency to offer recognition and gratitude incentives like a plaque or some, to give assistance to families of a donor with funeral costs. We do not know, Mr. Speaker. The minister should specify if such thoughts are in his mind, what will be part of a special policy direction. He needs to say. At Part 3, Section 15, Clause 4, he speaks to the issuance of donor card to registrants. Mr. Speaker, it's a myth to think that donor card is enough for consent. It is our opinion on this side of the assembly that such card was never intended to give consent, but a reminder of one's wishes. Part 5, Section 21, Clause 3, speaks to the donor and designated officer only being asked to consider the impact on the health of the donor. Mr. Speaker, the APNU AFC coalition is positing that a donor must not be made to give a kidney to someone whose underlying conditions will make it likely that if their life expectancy would only slightly increase with a new kidney, we believe that every effort must be made to consider WHO's guiding principle number 10, which states, as I quote, the long-term outcomes of cell, tissue, and organ donation and transplantation should be assessed for the living donor as well as the recipient in order to document benefit and harm. Ms. Speaker, are there sufficient safeguards? I think there are insufficient safeguards to prohibit the removal of transplantation of human organs and tissue for any purpose other than rapiatic purposes. The minister spoke about cell tissue, cultures, and so forth. Cell-based tissues are important, but of course there are certain risks which you need to take into consideration, Mr. Speaker, because there are risk factors associated with the intrinsic cellular properties of a particular cell type, class of stem cells, as well as extrinsic factors that can be introduced by procurement issues, handling, culturing, or staging of such cells. There's also the potential risk of tumor formation, risk of human pathogen transmission, and adventitious agents. So we need to, as we talk about that, we need to take that into consideration. At part 6, it is the belief of this side of the assembly that there should be a representative of the law, agency, or justice on the independent assessment committee, and that there should be 3 medical practitioners rather than 2 nominated by the minister as seen in Schedule 1. Also, Mr. Speaker, according to World Health Organization, consent is the ethical cornerstone of all medical interventions. Guiding principle number 4 states that there is a general prohibition on the removal of cells, tissue, or organs from legal minors for transplantation. So looking at part 6, clause 4b, it talks about a minor consent, giving consent to the removal of an organ. And it's our wish that there should be the inclusion not only of the minor, but other legally incompetent persons to this section and not just minors. Therefore, the use of living donors as minors could raise many ethical, moral, and societal issues regarding supply and the method of organ allocation. Mr. Speaker, such actions could lead to the practice of organ sale by entrepreneurs for financial gains through exploitation of the poor for the benefit of the wealthy. In addition, Mr. Speaker, you would know that a minor might just be saying yes because mommy wants him or her to give the sibling a liver or an organ, that they might be saying yes, but really the body language may be saying no. In that case, on the part of the child, there is no provision made to consider the child's body language, meaning that the true language of the child should override any consent given by the parents. Of course, attention must be paid to the child so that he or she is not being forced or coerced by parents who may have a conflict of interest. So for emphasis, Mr. Speaker, the World Health Organization, WHO, has stated categorically that minors and incompetent persons should be protected as out in its guiding principle number 4, which relates to human cell, tissue, and organ transplantation. Part 9, Section 45, Clause 4, speaks to the nearest relative of a person. The word used as nearest relative should be a little more specific. Are you speaking to a grandmother, a grandfather, a surrogate? You know, we need to know. Mr. Speaker, though this bill, number 19 of 2021, is timely, the populace doesn't have a full understanding of this subject, as there are human rights issues. We believe that the consultative process, which was started by the coalition government in 2017, should have been continued, and that there should have been a broad information campaign explaining all the provisions made in this new legislation. Efforts must be made to counteract any negative attitude to organ donation, especially among citizens in the middle age, 50s to 60s, who would be interested in such development. It is our wish that the interests and the freedoms of all participants would be accepted and that the principles of procedural justice be practiced, as the latter could help to counteract inequities and imbalances among those involved. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, it is problematic to trust the current regime as to whether the vulnerable will benefit from the distribution of these medical and scientific technologies to save lives. While it has been alleged that there are examples of ethnic cleansing and the practice of political division, the question that is being asked by the 218,000 members of the populace, Mr. Speaker, could this regime be trusted? Mr. Speaker, we have seen the bad governance and the mismanagement of COVID-19, including the improper sourcing of a vaccine from a middleman as it relates to the health of the nation. The citizens would want to know, they asked me to ask you, if with the passing of this bill, if there will be any act of corruption and the flourishing of commercial human organ harvesting, transplant tourism, and organ trafficking. Mr. Speaker, the citizens of Guyana would want to ask me to ask you, they want to know if with the implementation of such a technology with little safeguards, whether this bill would be dangerous. Mr. Speaker, the populace asked me to ask them, they want to know if this good technology being placed in bad hands would not be tantamount to a bill that kills. Mr. Speaker, while I recognize a plus, it is filled with pus. Thus, or therefore, let's mash the brake and slow the pace. I cannot support the bill because of its potential to kill in the hands of a reckless government whose legitimacy is still on the line. I rest my case, Mr. Speaker, and say that it would be challenging at best and foolhardy at worst to put the nation's health in political leaders who are irresponsible. Mr. Speaker, it is our wish that Bill number 19 of 2021 goes to the Select Committee to consider the various points that I've made in my submission. Thank you very much. As many of you would be aware from our experience here in Guyana, there are cultural and behavioral sensitivities that must be considered. And it is for that reason that in the past, we have done interventions like the CAP survey that was done on the behaviors related to voluntary blood donation here in Guyana. As there has been a more family replacement culture than voluntary donation, which are considered more altruistic and safer. Let me also say on this point that there is evidence that despite improvements in the general population, some minority groups as a whole are still reluctant to become organ donors in many countries. For instance, in the USA, there has been shown to be least supportive of organ donation. And this is according to the US Department of Health and Human Services. Globally, where these services exist, marginalized groups are less likely to consent to the procurement of a loved one's organ. They are less likely to discuss donation with family. They are less knowledgeable, and they purport to have higher levels of distrust when compared to the majority. This reluctance adds complexity to the efforts seeking to register organ donors. Despite this added dimension of complexity, most of the factors contributing to minority apprehension towards organ donation could seemingly be linked to a knowledge deficit or a lack of understanding about human organ and tissue transplant process, making prior public consultations and debate primary interventions to eliminate these disparities. I think all of us in this House understand how delicate this issue can be. And it is not just an added responsibility or a duty on the very long list of duties our clinicians already have. But what we have to bear in mind is the culture of our people and the hospitals, which will be very key determinants of the rollout of the donation and transplantation. One of the most important lessons learned over the years is that these debates would only be effective if people have a full understanding of the subject, especially when the subject raises human rights issues, as in the case with this bill. At a minimum, a debate such as this should be preceded by a broad information campaign with detailed explanations of all of the provisions proposed in the new legislation. Our recommendation is that this bill has potential and it should be sent to a special select committee where pertinent and technical matters can be discussed. The government should do its work and try to create a supportive societal environment and gain public trust before passing of such a delicate bill. Mr. Speaker, I now wish to turn my attention to WHO's guiding principles on human cell tissue and organ transplantations, which over the past 2 decades have greatly influenced professional codes and practices, as well as legislation around the world. And I would specifically recommend that guiding principles 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9 be the subject of public discussions prior to the tabling of this bill. In the case of Principle 2, it is designed to avoid conflict of interest that may arise when the physician or physicians determining the health of a potential donor
to be responsible in addition for the care of other patients whose welfare depend on cells, tissues, or organs transplanted from that donor. Principle 4 states a general prohibition on the removal of cells, tissues, or organs from legal minors for transplantation, while the permission of the parents or the legal guardian for organ removal is usually sufficient. There, they may have a conflict of interest if they are responsible for the welfare of the intended recipient. In such cases, review and approval by an independent body, such as a court or other competent authority, should be required. In any event, a minor's objection to making a donation should prevail over the permission provided by any other party. The professional counsel provided a potential living donor in order to assess and, when needed, address any pressure in the decision to donate is especially important for minor donors. Principle 5 makes the point that payment for cells, tissues, and organs is likely to take advantage of the poorest and most vulnerable groups, which undermines altruistic donation and leads to profiteering. Such payments conveys the idea that some persons lack dignity and that they are mere objects to be used by others. National laws should ensure that any gifts or rewards are not in fact disguised form of payments for donated cells, tissues, or organs. Incentives in the form of reward, whether it be monetary value that can be transferred to third parties, are not different from payments. While the worst abuses involve living organ donors, dangers also arise when payments for cells, tissues, and organs are made to next of kin of deceased persons, to vendors or brokers, or institutions such as mortuaries having charge of dead bodies. Financial returns to such parties should be forbidden. Mr. Speaker, I would now want to look at Schedule 1, Constitution of the Agency. This brings to the fore the issue of governance of the national regulatory body. From my review and experience, I would have hoped to see the inclusion of an oversight committee as part of the governance structure. I know such an oversight committee was in place for blood safety when Guyana embarked on the rapid strengthening of blood transfusion services here with the support of PEPFAR. The governance structure proposed, where the agency is the accountable entity, is unusual and inadequate for transplantation and may not deliver effective and efficient governance to the agency. I will leave that there. Moving along, Mr. Speaker, I would like to look at Part 10 of the bill, which I think needs relooking, and it speaks to prohibition of trading. This part is woefully inadequate. There are glaring omissions and the lack of basic safeguard mechanisms for the people of this country. In fact, from my research, I have found that this bill is a knockoff of the Human Tissue Transplant Act of Trinidad and Tobago, Chapter 2807, Act 13 of 2000. From the date, you would recognize that the Trinidad and Tobago Act predates WHO's current version of the guiding principles of human cell tissue, and organ transplantation. In other legislations, including the countries where the experts that provided the technical assistance for the framing of this document came from, there is usually a part of the legislation which deals extensively with offenses and penalties, far beyond prohibition of trading. And that section would usually cover areas such as punishment for the removal of human organ without authority, has nothing to do with prohibition of trading. How you are proposing to deal with any person who renders his service to or at any hospital and who for purposes of transplantation conducts, associates with, or help in any manner the removal of any human organ without authority. There's also punishment for commercial dealings in human organs, and there are a whole list of them that you can find in other legislations. And I would suggest that, for what it's worth, that be looked at. There's punishment for illegal dealings in human tissues, which is looking at the preparation or submission of false documents, including giving false affidavits to establish that the donor is making the donation of the human tissues as a near relative or by person of affection or attachment towards the recipient. In other legislations, there's also punishment for contravention of any other provisions that would be in a bill. And so whoever contravenes any provision of this bill or any rule made or any condition of the registration granted thereunder, for which no punishment is separately provided in this act, that should be punishable. And then there's also offenses by companies, which are offenses that should be punishable by this bill. And so somebody who would acting on the part of a company, there should be provisions to deal with that person or persons who at the time of the offense was committed, who at the time the offense was committed was in charge of and was responsible to the company for the conduct of the business. These are things that I believe that are important and they should have been considered and mentioned. This brings me to another part on the same part 10. I want to look specifically at 51(2)(b), and I think it needs to be revised.